Hello and welcome back to The Gaggle. I'm Ciara Haley and you're joined by my guests, Jim Rogers in Singapore and George Szamuely in Budapest. Welcome back. So, we have been discussing China's interests in the Middle East, and I just want to open up the conversation to look at how the US and Chinese tensions and the degradation of their relationship may have influenced the Middle East looking towards China and China looking towards them to foster greater bonds between the two countries. George, if you'd like to jump in on this one.
Well, it's very interesting because, of course, one aspect of China's Belt and Road Initiative and China's massive increase in influence that needs to be addressed is China's relative military vulnerability vis-a-vis the United States. China as a military power is still relatively insignificant in comparison to the United States and Russia. And therefore, its energy, which goes through the Straits of Hormuz, the Straits of Malacca, is very vulnerable. I mean, those tankers can be easily waylaid. They could get stuck in crossfire between various protagonists in the Middle East, should there be a war between Iran and the United States and Saudi Arabia, whatever. And so if China wants to be a global power and it wants to be a very serious player in the Middle East, it will have to address its military vulnerability, because it can't just simply be shipping tankers across the world without and be vulnerable to United States pressure. So I think that's something we're going to look at, and then we'll see how the United States responds to China's growing military power.
Actually, George, just to add to that, if you look at the Arab Spring in 2011, in Libya, for example, China had 40,000 citizens to evacuate, which was a massive deal, massive operation, something they did not expect and up until that point in time had never had to deal with. But going back to your security points, I think, yeah, it's an issue that they will have to think about is how to make it more secure, especially with the US policy of disengagement towards the Middle East.
Ciara, I was just going to raise one difference between the U.S. and China in that part of the world is China has a lot to sell to the Middle East. America doesn't have much to sell to anywhere, and there are tens of millions of people there in the Middle East, depending on how you define it. And so China, obviously, it's not that important a market for China, but China's got a lot of stuff to sell. And the Middle Easterners need a lot of stuff, and they're not going to buy TVs from America. Might buy cars, but not much else. So China has a lot to sell and is selling a lot.
Yes, and George, also adding to Jim's point there, also Chinese labor, physical labor that they export around the world is a big aspect of bolstering these economies, emerging economies, building roads and whatever else, and just basic infrastructure of countries that have been ravaged by war or that are just in the initial stages of reaching full capacity for their economic interest.
Yes, no question. Labor, plentiful labor that China can transfer, and of course, plentiful expertise, science, engineering, technology. But what is really important is that the countries that have been demonized and ostracized and sanctioned by the United States now have somewhere to go. So the United States, puts the screws on Iran, puts even worse screws on Syria, but now they have somewhere to go. They're not going to just simply collapse because there's China there. Now, this is where it gets a little dangerous because you have to wonder how long will the United States put up with essentially its will being defied so openly by China. And that's why I think there could well be some dangerous confrontation in the near future between America and China, because America imposes sanctions, China just happily violates the sanctions. And the United States isn't going to tolerate being defied so openly in this way.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, I think the recent agreement that's been leaked between Iran and China and the agreements that they're trying to come to terms with has caused a lot of trouble for American policymakers and the American security influencers. I think that's a legitimate security threat. Jim, I just wanted to ask you also, how beneficial do you think it is for these countries to have a China card to play? So when they're conducting business, they can say to whatever offers you may get from the US or from Europe, you have a China card to say, well, I've got this better deal. Can you go higher?
Well, Ciara, we all know about life. It's always good to have a competitor. If you are trying to buy a car, you want to have two sources. If you want to get a girlfriend or a boyfriend, you want two possibilities. So that you have something that you can play off against the other. This is the way life has always worked. Now, for a while there, when the Soviet Union was doing, falling apart there was no alternative except the U.S. And so the U.S. could come in and say, you do it our way, you don't do it. But now China has come in and say, we will listen to you. We have some suggestions too. And so whoever you are, you have an alternate supplier. That's the way life works, not just politics and foreign affairs. And that's what's happening now. China sees, maybe Russia sees the vacuum a little bit and is coming back some, but China's moving into a vacuum.
Yeah, and it's also true to say that I think it's 60% of all Chinese exports to Africa and Europe actually go through the UAE and Dubai. So that's a very big necessity to keep good relations with them for China doing business with the rest of the world. And in that sense, it's staying true to the Silk Road idea fostered since the beginning of trade and since the beginning of collaborations between China and the Middle East. But George,
it's just very interesting. Just to follow up on that, is that China manages to maintain good relations with both sides. I mean, so China has very good relations with Iran, as you mentioned, but it's also good relations with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. So it's a very much a kind of a, we don't care about, what your internal politics are or who your allies are. We want to have good relations with you.
Yeah.
And that's very attractive and very much contrary to the American and to a certain extent the European position.
Yeah, it's very, very effective model. And going beyond this, I think the obvious need for natural resources to bolster the Chinese plans for their own economy gives a very strong tie with developing infrastructure in these companies, because when you have stability in the country, then you have more output from that country.
Well, China also has huge infrastructure capacity, building capacity, as you know. We talked about the labor. China's got a lot of labor to go around and build highways. America doesn't have much cheap labor to build bridges and infrastructure. So it's obvious that China has another advantage besides selling, bicycles. They can also sell infrastructure, and America is not terribly competitive at building infrastructure.
Yeah, it's one of the big draws to doing business with China, I think. George, how possible do you think it is to have such a close economic tie with a region and to avoid getting involved in the political dilemmas that may arise, particularly with the US trying to withdraw their power a little bit, let's say? As they withdraw, previously China has relied on their presence to brush off any concerns of security because they're there. Everyone will focus the hatred towards the US. They will be a punching bag for whatever conflict may arise. But as they disengage, do you think China is going to have to step up security measures to a significant extent to deal with the fact that it's quite hard to unravel economic and political dilemmas in the one place?
Well, I think so, because so far in the infrastructure projects, they're building ports, but they haven't really built any military bases. I think they have one military base in Djibouti. There will be, clearly, the Chinese will move towards turning some of these ports into naval bases. I mean, it's inevitable, precisely because what we were talking about earlier, the Chinese are vulnerable to their energy exports. when they go through the Straits of Hormuz, Straits of Malacca, China will have to address that problem because if you're going to be a major geopolitical power, you can't just be cut off from your energy sources, at the drop of a hat, which China could be at the moment. So they will therefore start developing military bases and naval bases, air bases in the Middle East. And then we have to see how will the United States respond to that. They're not just going to be lying down.
Yeah, on that, Jim, what do you predict for the future of this relationship? Do you think that it's going to be inflammatory towards the US?
Well, Ciara, before I said we'll know in 30 years, right now that China is just going in there being calm and peaceful and quiet. I said 30 years. We'll know long before 30 years because there are going to be some kind of conflicts or arguments or something arising because America's not just going to sit there and watch China get more and more influence and more power and more markets. I mean, we all know that's how great powers work. I'm not endorsing it by any stretch, but the Russians did it, the British did it, the French did it. Everybody gets angry when a new guy shows up on the block. America will too. So it's good for gaggle because you'll have a lot to report. It may not be good for the world, but it'll certainly be good for gaggle.
And a lot to discuss. George, what are your predictions for the near future, let's say, within Jim's 30-year spectrum?
I tend to think that some serious confrontation with China will happen before the 30 years are up. So I think probably within the next 10 years there will be, because Trump was clearly a trailblazer. He saw in 2016 China is the real issue, not Russia. The Democrats were still stuck. The needle was stuck in 1972 with the Democrats. Trump saw this. But I think others are going to start following and realize, China is the real issue, not Russia. And I think that whoever will be in the White House next January will have China, front and center of their agenda. So I tend to think a serious confrontation with China is coming.
Ciara, whenever things go wrong, people blame foreigners. It's happened throughout history. I'm just talking about America. I'm talking about everybody. Yeah. Politicians love to blame foreigners. It's easy. They have different languages, different skins, different food, different hair, different everything. They smell bad. Their food smells bad. Politicians love to play the anti-foreign card, and they do, and they always have, and they always will. And that's what American politicians are doing at the moment. But it's not picking on America. It's the way politicians have worked throughout history. It's not good for history. They should be saying, let's all work together to bring great prosperity to each other. Let's go dancing and drinking and singing and having a good time. The politicians don't think that way, Ciara.
Well, I wish they did, Jim. I wish they did. It would be much nicer if they did.
We could all meet in Budapest and go drinking and dancing.
Oh, George, nice. You arrange it.
Absolutely. I'll arrange it. Sure. Come on over, Jim.
Thank you very much, both of you, for joining me. It's been a very interesting discussion. I'll finish with the sentiments that if we think 20 years back, the Middle East was a bit of a sideshow for China, and China was almost insignificant for the Middle East, but how times have changed and will continue to change, as you both have mentioned.
I just want to jump in while we're ending. I said 30 years. George says it's not going to be 30. It's not going to be 30 years. Unfortunately, we're going to see more and more clashes, conflicts, maybe worse in the next few years. It's not good for the world, but be worried, be prepared. Yeah.
On that note, we'll finish our discussion for today. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Ciara.
Thank you, Ciara. Watch Gaggle.